Japan has the lowest unemployment rate among any major economy on Earth, around Nitan Wu percent. For context, that's roughly half the US rate and well below most of Europe. By that measure, Japan's labor market is the envy of the developed world.
Now here's the number. Miami
Two 2.5% unemployment, 40% of workers with precarious jobs. Both numbers are true at the same time, and the reason they can be true at the same time is one of the most persistent, most consequential myths in global business, the idea that Japan has lifetime employment.
This episode is about that myth, where it came from, who it actually covered, who it left behind, and what happens to a society when a story about work becomes more real than the work itself.
Let's start with what lifetime employment actually refers to. The Japanese term is shūshin koyō, employment for life. The idea is straightforward. A major Japanese company recruits graduates fresh from university, integrates them into the firm through extensive internal training, promotes them based on seniority and loyalty, and retains them through to retirement, typically around age 60. In exchange, the employee pledges dedication, flexibility to be relocated or reassigned, and implicitly a lifetime of their productive years to one employer.
And the system worked. For the companies that used it, through Japan's post-war economic miracle, the extraordinary growth decades of the 1950s through the late 1980s, shūshin koyō gave large corporations a stable, highly trained, intensely loyal workforce. Workers invested in the firm's success because their futures were literally tied to it. Companies invested in workers because turnover was negligible and the return on training was guaranteed. The mutual investment loop was genuinely productive.
By the 1970s and 1980s, business schools in the United States and Europe were studying Japanese management practices with something close to reverence. Articles appeared in Harvard Business Review. Best-selling books were written. American executives flew to Tokyo to understand the secret, and the picture that emerged: cohesive, committed workforces, companies that looked after their people, no fear of sudden layoffs, became the dominant image of Japanese work culture in the Western imagination.
That image was not false. It was something more dangerous than false. It was selectively true. Here is what was actually covered by shūshin koyō.
Empirical research, including data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, consistently found that genuine lifetime employment applied to roughly 20 to 30% of Japan's workforce at its peak. The specific profile: male employees, white-collar roles at large corporations or government bodies. That's it.
Women were largely excluded. Small and medium-sized companies, which employ the vast majority of workers in Japan, could not afford the system. Part-time workers, temp workers, contract workers, none of this applied to them. As Nippon.com noted in a detailed historical analysis, lifetime employment was never as universal as commonly believed. Today, only about 1 in 5 workers enjoys lifetime employment, and those are male employees working in large firms or government bureaus.
In other words, at the system's peak, 4 out of 5 Japanese workers did not have lifetime employment. The West looked at the 1 in 5 and concluded it described everyone.
But here's where the story gets complicated, because even if the system only covered a minority, it shaped the expectations of nearly everyone. The large companies set the cultural norm. Small companies aspired to it, even when they couldn't deliver it. Workers measured their success against it. Men who didn't achieve it experienced it as failure. Women who were excluded from it largely accepted that exclusion as part of the social contract.
So the myth wasn't just a misunderstanding by foreign observers. It was a self-mythology that Japan's own labor market internalized.
Then the bubble burst. In Shinshibai, Japan's extraordinary asset price bubble collapsed. Real estate values fell by half or more in many markets. The Nikkei stock index, which had touched nearly shūshin at its peak, began a 17-year decline. Corporate Japan, suddenly unviable at its previous cost structure, faced an existential choice.
Western companies in this situation typically lay off workers. That is the accepted playbook. Headcount comes down, balance sheets stabilize, investors applaud, workers absorb the blow.
Japanese corporations, as we explored in episode 4 on the Shunto wage revolution, did something different, deeply committed to the implicit contract of lifetime employment, at least for their core regular workforce. They cut costs in other ways, they froze wages, they slashed bonuses, which in Japan can represent 3 to 5 months of annual compensation. They stopped hiring new regular employees.
That last choice is the one with the longest shadow. Through most of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Japan's large corporations dramatically reduced their intake of new regular graduates. Companies that had previously hired hundreds of fresh university graduates each spring started hiring dozens, or none at all. The regular employment ladder, the one that led to the seniority system, the pension, the lifetime security, simply stopped accepting new entrants.
This period is now called the Employment Ice Age, in Japanese, shūshoku hyōgaki, and the people who graduated into that ice age are still living with the consequences.
There are an estimated 17 to 20 million people in Japan today who belong to the Employment Ice Age generation. They are now in their 40s and 50s. They graduated between roughly Sentu Bakushisu and Nesensu, precisely the years when the hiring windows slammed shut.
The data on what happened to them is grim. Workers from this cohort who managed to find regular employment were significantly underpaid compared to what earlier cohorts had earned at equivalent career stages. But tens of millions did not find regular employment at all. They entered the workforce as part-timers, contract workers, or temps because that was all available, and many never transitioned out. The non-regular track in Japan, unlike the regular track, comes with no automatic promotions, minimal training investment by employers, and substantially lower wages.
As a Mayu Baintoni
The numbers on wage stagnation within this cohort are telling. According to Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare data, workers aged 40 to 44 saw only a 7% wage increase over recent years, against broader gains across the economy. Workers 50 to 54 saw just 10%.
The Ice Age generation, even those who did find regular employment late, earned less, advanced more slowly, and accumulated less wealth than the cohorts immediately before and after them.
The Japanese government has, belatedly, acknowledged the scale of the problem. On April 2021, the government adopted a new 3-year support program specifically targeting the employment Ice Age generation, focused on improving working conditions, housing security, reskilling for digital and AI roles, and expanding government employment of this cohort. It is the third such program. The previous 2 were assessed as insufficient.
17 to 20 million people. An entire generation shaped by the gap between the myth and the mechanics of the system that supposedly protected everyone.
Now let's look at the 40% number. By no shūshin, permanent workers have exceeded 40% of Japan's total workforce for the first time. That threshold, 4 in 10 workers with no secure employment status, would have been unimaginable to the architects of the post-war system.
The gender dimension is stark. According to data from Japan's Statistics Bureau, 61% of female workers in Japan are employed on a non-permanent basis. 61%, less than 22% of male workers are in the same situation. The supposed universality of lifetime employment always had a deeply gendered shape, and those contours have grown sharper, not softer, over time.
The wage gap compounds it. The OECD's employment outlook for Japan notes that as of Nisei, non-regular workers earn approximately 70% of the hourly wage of regular employees performing equivalent work, not 70% of total compensation, which would be worse once you account for bonuses and benefits, 70% of base hourly wages.
Think about what that means structurally. Japan has low unemployment. Virtually everyone who wants a job can find one, but 4 in 10 of those jobs offer meaningfully inferior wages, no security, and limited prospects for advancement. The unemployment rate measures whether people have work. It says nothing about whether that work provides a path forward.
Here is where something unexpected enters the story. The younger generation, the workers born after the Ice Age cohort who watched what happened to their predecessors, is not particularly interested in lifetime employment anymore.
A survey cited by Nippon.com found that only 30.1% of young Japanese workers today say they wish to work at one company through to retirement. That number is less than a third of the workforce. And behaviorally, the data is even sharper. 47% of Generation Z workers in Japan say they plan to leave their current employer within 3 years. More than half say they might quit before completing even a single year.
This is not rebellion for its own sake, it is rational adaptation. A generation that watched their parents' generation cling to employers who did not reciprocate, who saw their older siblings fall into the Ice Age trap of precarious, non-regular work, has concluded, not unreasonably, that loyalty to a single employer is a bad bet. In its place,
Mid-career hiring, once rare in Japan's new graduate-centric system, has become mainstream. A Nisen Argum Nippon.com survey found that 54% of companies said they would become more proactive in mid-career recruitment, against only 7.4% who plan to become less proactive. When those same companies were asked why they were opening up mid-career hiring, the most common answer was to supplement the workforce with immediately effective personnel.
Japan's labor shortage at 30-year highs, with a job-to-applicant ratio between Itian Ipai and Itian Erlin, has forced companies to compete for workers they once expected to arrive as fresh graduates and stay forever.
The tight labor market has real power in this transition. When you have more job openings than job seekers, workers have options. And when workers have options, the implicit contract of loyalty in exchange for security loses its hold.
The companies themselves are adapting, though more slowly than the headlines suggest. In RC1, Toyota, arguably the company most associated with Japanese employment practices globally, introduced what Japan's business community calls job-type employment, or shokumagata koyō. Under this model, wages are tied to specific job grades and the responsibilities of a defined role, rather than to seniority and tenure. Panasonic introduced a similar framework. The significance is hard to overstate if Toyota is moving toward defined role compensation. The psychological signal to every other large Japanese employer is that the old model is no longer sacred.
The government has pushed in the same direction. Under the Labor Mobility and Reskilling Initiative associated with former Prime Minister Kishida, Japan committed to investing approximately 1 trillion yen, roughly $1.4 billion, over 5 years specifically to support individual reskilling and facilitate the movement of workers into higher productivity sectors. Unemployment benefits are being restructured to support transitions rather than just maintenance. Public-private information sharing systems are being built to help workers navigate career development.
The Asae Shunto spring wage negotiations produced a headline average increase of Wudian Lingjiu %, the third consecutive year above 5%, according to Japan's trade union confederation Rengo. But buried in those figures is something structurally important: pressure to extend comparable increases to non-regular workers, something that would have been nearly unthinkable in previous decades. The spread of wage gains to the precarious tier is slower and patchier than for regular employees, but it is happening.
So where does this leave the myth? Shūshin koyō was a real system. It genuinely worked for the 20 to 30% of the workforce it covered. But the story told about it, in Western business schools, in management bestsellers, in the assumptions that underpinned foreign investment analysis of Japan, inflated a minority practice into a universal descriptor. That inflation had consequences.
It let Japan's policymakers delay addressing the two-tier labor market because the bottom tier was invisible under the umbrella of the myth. It let companies extract loyalty from workers who had culturally internalized the expectation of reciprocity, even when the company was not in fact reciprocating. It gave the 1990s hiring freeze a cover story: we're protecting the people we already have, maintaining our obligations. The people excluded from the system were, in that framing, simply not part of the picture.
The employment ice age generation is the direct human cost of that framing. And this is the Japan factor. Lifetime employment was not a description of Japanese labor markets. It was a projection, a condensed symbol of what Japan appeared to offer that the West did not. Job security, corporate loyalty, long-term thinking over quarterly cycles. These are real values embedded in real Japanese institutions. They were and remain genuine.
But the symbol obscured the mechanism. And the mechanism was always more selective, more conditional, and more gendered than the symbol implied.
Japan is now in the middle of a genuine labor market transformation, possibly the most significant since the post-war reconstruction of these practices in the first place. The Ice Age generation is finally receiving official acknowledgement and targeted government support, however late. Gen Z is rewriting the implicit employment contract on their own terms, voting with their feet in a job market that for the first time has enough vacancies to allow them to. Toyota and Panasonic are putting job-type compensation structures on the table, signaling that the seniority ladder is no longer the only path.
The myth is dissolving, not because it was entirely wrong, but because the Japan that needs it has changed. A society with an unemployment rate of 2.5%, labor shortages across virtually every sector, and a generation of young workers with genuinely portable skills in a globally competitive economy does not need a myth of security. It needs actual mechanisms that deliver security more broadly and more equitably.
The real question now is whether the dissolution of the old story can outpace the damage still accumulating for the generation that believed in it longest.
17 to 20 million people in their 40s and 50s, entering the last productive decade of their working lives with the legacy of the Ice Age still in their paychecks and pension projections. For them, the myth never ended, it just stopped applying.